My husband's best friend took my child away from me. A secret scheme that destroyed our entire marriage. I never thought anyone could interfere in our family so deeply that they would practically deprive me of the chance to be a mother to my own child. I lived a calm life where everything seemed logical and proper. I loved my husband, was raising our son, and we were making plans for the future. Only now, as time has passed, do I realize how many subtle signs I missed, how blindly I trusted people who deserved only distrust. My story is not about a simple affair, but about a far more cunning scheme. My husband's best friend ingratiated himself into our family so much that he not only turned my husband against me, but took from me the most precious thing. I remember how that person was always at my husband's side. I recall first meeting him back when my husband and I were still at university. We were young and enthusiastic, dreaming of success and careers. My husband had a close friend studying at a parallel department who often visited us. He had a certain charm, a gift for conversation, a knack for choosing words that made people like him. I barely paid attention, seeing him only as a pleasant companion to my husband's circle. Yet even then, I sometimes caught him looking at me in a way that felt studying. I dismissed it, thinking I was simply oversensitive. Years went by. My husband and I got married, settled into our lives. The best friend remained a frequent visitor. By then, he had a job and was into psychology courses, often boasting about his ability to understand people's emotions better than any therapist. Part of it felt like harmless bragging, but he truly had some gift for winning people over. I knew my husband valued his advice, especially regarding business and relationships. Maybe I should have been more alert when I noticed my husband at times trusted his friend's opinion more than mine. But I loved my husband, wanted him to have strong friendships, and did not want to appear like a jealous wife searching for enemies where there were none. When our son was born, we were happy. That baby was the center of our world. My husband often spoke proudly of having an heir, and I plunged into caring for the child. My husband's best friend started dropping by more frequently. He brought gifts for our son, offered to push the stroller if I was exhausted. Sometimes the intensity of his attention seemed excessive. He could hold our child for an hour, marveling at how wonderful he was, saying how much he loved children. Part of me felt flattered, seeing it as genuine support, but part of me felt uneasy, as if he were trying to become more important in our family than just a friend. Again, I talked myself out of those doubts, deciding he was simply caring and kind. Problems surfaced as our child grew older. My husband, trusting his friend, often asked him to help with babysitting if we were busy, or to take our son to the doctor if I had an appointment. On the surface, he seemed highly competent. He possessed parenting manuals, read child development books. I thought there was no harm in letting him help, especially since my husband insisted his friend loved kids and truly wanted to spend time with ours. I told myself it was good the child would have extra attention. Over time, I noticed that when people asked our son who his best friend was, he sometimes replied not me or my husband, but uncle. Initially, it was cute, but it started to bother me. I wondered why. Maybe I was not giving enough time or attention, so he saw my husband's friend as some sort of second parent. But I suppressed those worries, telling myself not to be jealous or selfish. That bond between my husband's friend and my son kept growing. He gifted expensive toys, took him to amusement parks, often paying for everything. My husband seemed unconcerned, maybe even found it convenient. But deep inside, I had a small alarm. Is he overstepping, grabbing too big a place in my son's life? Whenever I tried to raise the issue with my husband, he dismissed me, saying I was blowing it out of proportion, that this friend only wanted to help our child. It was easier for my husband if someone else took on the burden of childcare, so he did not have to, and I did not want to come off as controlling or suspicious. I realized our son looked to this uncle more and more, calling him not just his best friend but something like another father. That bothered me. I asked my husband how he felt. He shrugged, saying it was some game the child invented, that it was harmless. But I was worried. Then I tried talking to my son, asking if he missed me or his father. My son said the uncle told him sometimes outsiders are closer than family, that maybe I was too strict. That turned my stomach. Why was this man telling my child such things? I confronted my husband, saying that his friend was intruding too deeply. My husband insisted I was exaggerating, that the friend was just doing good, that the child was happy. I saw that my husband found the arrangement convenient, and I, not wanting more conflict, from there it got worse. I saw my son complaining about me being too strict, about me limiting his screen time. My husband started scolding me, saying the friend was right, that I was damaging our son psychologically with all my rules. I felt anger. I was simply practicing normal, healthy parenting, but it seemed my husband and his friend had formed a block, turning me into the villain. My husband claimed not to see a problem. My son started avoiding me altogether, rarely hugging me. He waited for uncle to arrive, so he could share his joys. That tore at me, that my own child was choosing some outside person over me. I asked him why he no longer confided in me. He said the uncle understood him better, that I was always unhappy. I felt a stab in my heart. I'd always tried to be caring, but someone convinced my son otherwise. Over the weeks, my bond with my son eroded. He eyed me with distrust. Then came an even darker turn. The friend told my husband that our child needed therapy, that he showed signs of anxiety and aggression, possibly caused by me. My husband, who once had been a rational man, believed him. He said we should see a psychologist recommended by his friend. I was not opposed to therapy, but was alarmed that the entire process was led by that friend, who had no rightful place deciding how to raise our child. We visited the psychologist that the friend suggested. I noticed that he spent more time privately talking to my husband and the friend than to me, yet drew conclusions that I was too cold and needed to change my ways. I suspected this was not a real impartial professional but someone planted by the friend, manipulating the results to fit their scenario. Sure enough, the final statement from the psychologist declared the child lacked emotional warmth from his mother, that I was too strict and needed to alter my behavior. My husband latched onto it. You see, your attitude is harming our son. I felt desperation. I'd never considered myself cold. I'd always been loving. But my husband, his best friend, and that pseudo-specialist formed a united front. My husband then started threatening that unless I accepted their new, fully permissive approach, he might take our child away from me entirely. I found it ludicrous. We were supposed to decide these matters together, but everything was spiraling out of control. One day, I noticed official documents missing, including our son's birth certificate. I asked my husband if he knew anything. He said no. The next day, my son suddenly disappeared. My husband claimed he took him to see his parents for the weekend, but those parents said they never saw him. I was frantic, calling everyone. No one knew where my husband and son were. After a day and a half, my husband finally contacted me, calmly stating that he and our son were safe, that he wanted me to realize I had to change. I yelled, demanding how he could take our child without telling me. He answered that this was only temporary, to show me how I was destroying our son's psyche. I cried, begged him to return our son. He said he would if I signed some forms, agreeing to their new parenting system and ceasing all conflict with his friend. I was speechless. This was blackmail. I asked what his friend had to do with it. He said the friend had been right all along, and if I refused to listen, I'd lose my place in my son's life. On the fourth day, my husband came back, bringing our son. I saw in his eyes the cold determination of someone who had orchestrated all this. My boy looked uneasy, as if told how bad I was but not able to articulate it. My husband said he was giving me one last chance to reform or he would file for divorce and demand the child remain with him. The friend was also there. I tried to hug my son, but he pulled away. That moment broke my heart. I said I was not leaving my own home, that if my husband wanted a divorce, he should file. I pleaded with him to be reasonable. He responded that according to the psychologist's recommendations, the child should not be left alone with me, so his friend would stay in our home often to ensure I followed their new rules. It was insane. I shouted that this was tyranny. My husband sneered. The friend stood by with calm superiority. Thus began a claustrophobic existence. The friend was in our home daily, intervening in everything. He decided our son's bedtime, meals. If I asked our son to tidy his toys or do homework, they accused me of oppressing him. I felt systematically driven out of the family. My confused son took the path of least resistance, siding with the friend and his father, who let him do almost anything, painting me as the strict villain. After about a month in these conditions, my husband told me he was going to file for divorce. I asked about custody. He declared the child would stay with him because I was unfit, as proven by their psychologist. I was horrified, realizing they were labeling me a bad mother with no basis, using contrived reports. The three of them, my husband, his friend, and that psychologist, had shaped a scenario in which I looked incompetent. I rushed to a lawyer, describing what was happening. The lawyer advised me to gather statements from friends and relatives who could attest that I was a normal, caring mother. I tried contacting acquaintances, but many were reluctant to get involved, especially because they knew my husband's friend. Only a few were willing to testify in my support. My mother lived in another city. She could say I'd always been caring, but might not be considered objective. A few friends agreed to confirm I'd been loving, but we had little chance to stand up against the carefully staged narrative of that friend, that I was somehow harmful. The friend and my husband took it further, telling our son I was the reason for all the problems. The child began to fear me, no longer trusting me, only trusting the friend and father. My heartbreak was beyond measure. I decided to leave for a bit, so as not to see my son rejecting me in favor of that friend. I packed a bag and went to my mother's place, hoping my husband would rethink things. Instead, he filed for divorce, requesting custody of our child with him, claiming I had psychological issues, supported by that questionable expert. My sense of reality was unraveling. My lawyers said I'd need an independent examination, so I underwent it. That official authority found I was mentally stable. Still, my husband insisted I had hidden disorders, that the child was better off with him and the friend. They had built such a strong facade that I had almost no way to break it. We had a custody hearing. I could not stop crying as I saw my son with my husband and the friend. The court asked the boy with whom he wanted to live. He softly answered that he preferred dad and uncle. When asked why, he said mommy always scolded him, mommy did not love him, and the uncle told the truth. I shook with grief, trying to say my child had been manipulated, but the court only saw a child's statement, found no evidence of paternal abuse, and no grounds to fault the friend. They ruled the child would remain with the father. My own son would now live with my husband and his best friend, who effectively forced me out. My mother and I wept when I came back after the trial. The guilt devoured me. Where had I gone wrong? How did I fail to stop the manipulation of my husband's friend? How had he convinced my husband and child I was an enemy? Time passed and the divorce was finalized. The child remained with my husband, while I was granted only minimal visitation. Whenever I tried to see my son, the friend was there monitoring so I could never be alone with him. I saw my boy was frightened, uncertain. I left those visits in tears, stripped of real motherhood, while that friend presumably basked in becoming the bigger parent figure. Then my husband announced they were moving to another region or even out of the country. I feared losing my son entirely, asked my lawyers to block them from taking him away. But my husband managed to present me as mentally unstable and lacking steady income. The friend, with his manipulated evidence, painted me as dangerous. I still could not believe this was my life. They all left our city. I do not know precisely where they settled. I tried to message my son on social media, but the friend monitors his accounts. I attempted to call, but they blocked my number. Sometimes at night, I dream my son is calling out to me while that friend stands between us. I wake up shaking, knowing that dream is reality. I am a mother deprived of my child thanks to a stranger who wormed his way in and turned everything upside down. Now I rent a place, work in a small private office, saving money to try appealing the case at a higher level. My lawyers say it's complicated. We would need new evidence, possibly challenge the earlier psychological claims, the earlier court ruling. But the months slip by, my child is growing, and I fear that if I ever succeed, he'll already see me as a stranger. That pain is crushing. Sometimes I blame myself for not acting decisively when my husband's friend started intruding. Perhaps I should have drawn a line, but I was too worried about pushing my husband away and looking like a jealous wife. Now the price of my fear is losing my son. That cunning friend systematically swayed both father and child, painting me as a tyrant. I do not know if it was envy, hidden desire, or something else, but the outcome is the same. My family was destroyed, my son taken from me. My husband shares the blame, letting this happen. Possibly he was influenced or found it convenient for the friend to handle the child's upbringing. I often look at old photos. We, as a family, me, my husband, and our son are all smiling. In the background stands that friend, glancing in a particular way. It's as though from the beginning, he aimed to insert himself into our life. None of us believed a best friend could do that. People say it's impossible because a mother is always closest, but if two adults systematically work against you, your husband and his friend plus a so-called psychologist, even a child can be made to turn away. It has been 2 years now since my son stopped living with me. I rarely see him, only supervised short visits with the father and friend present. During those visits, my son does not run to me happily, but stands guarded, checking if I'm behaving right. I try to assure him I love him, that I'm not bad. He just stares at me, locked away. I go home and cry every time. They deprived me of motherhood, while the friend is presumably satisfied, fulfilling that paternal role that should be mine. Sometimes I see our son calling him second dad, with my husband accepting it. I share all this hoping it might help others recognize a similar danger. My story is not about an affair or jealousy. It's about how a person can come into your family and take your child away emotionally and legally, turning the mother into an outsider. Many think that cannot happen, that a mother is always the closest, but if two adults, father plus friend plus a complicit psychologist, systematically undermine you, even your own child can be alienated. I go on with life, though without my son, everything feels drained of color. I hope maybe one day I'll succeed in a new legal action or at least gain more visitation without being monitored. But so far, I'm losing. I keep a diary, writing how I always loved my son and the memories we shared. I am mostly alone, no longer trusting easily after all I've experienced. I fear a new relationship would only risk more heartbreak. I cling to the hope that my son will grow up, maybe go to college, and then try to find me himself, realizing I was never evil. For now, all I can do is wait and battle in courts, wanting to prove that friend's lies. People ask if my husband really does not see what happened. Maybe he does but finds it convenient letting the friend handle things. Or maybe he's fully believed I'm the villain. Sometimes I sit in my son's old room, which I've left untouched, with his toys, books, notebooks in place as though he's about to return. It hurts, but I will not move anything as long as I hope he'll walk in, see it all, and realize I always cared. Some might ask why I did not do more, like publicly expose the friend. But I lack solid proof. My husband called me hysterical if I complained, and the friend was cunning and calm. Even in court, he played the protective figure for our son, portraying me as unbalanced. I do not know how my story ends. Maybe one day my son will come asking why I did not fight harder. I'll tell him I did everything I could but was outnumbered. Or maybe my husband will eventually reject that friend, realizing he ruined our family, and let me have our son back. It hasn't happened yet. I only dream of a day I can hug my boy without him fearing me. As for the friend who staged this tragedy, maybe one day he'll face the consequences. But life is not always fair. This is the end of my long account of how my husband's best friend took my child away from me. Some people consider it unbelievable, but I truly lived through it. I hope my story serves as a warning and reminder that often the biggest threats come not from outside, but from within your closest circle of trust. If you sense something is wrong, act before it is too late, or you may end up in the nightmare I did.